For 11 years, 3 months, and 4 days, Diane's husband had been living a double life. And she only found out because a 17-year-old girl named Kayla hit Add Friend on Facebook. Diane sat in her kitchen that Tuesday morning with her second cup of coffee going cold on the counter, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, squinting at her phone screen the way she always did when she couldn't quite make sense of something. The profile photo showed a pretty teenager with dark eyes and a wide, dimpled smile. The name said Kayla Mercer, and under People You May Know, the algorithm had done something cruel and efficient. It listed one mutual connection: her husband, Greg. But to understand how a single Facebook notification unraveled 11 years of lies, we need to go back to the beginning. Diane Mercer met Greg at a company barbecue in the summer of 2007. She was 31, freshly out of a long relationship, not really looking for anything. He was charming in the effortless way of men who have had a lot of practice being charming. Warm eyes, easy laugh, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and called his mother on Sundays. They dated for 8 months. He proposed on a rainy Thursday with a ring he'd had sized perfectly. She said yes before he finished the sentence. Their life together was quietly good. Not extraordinary, but solid. They bought a house in a leafy suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. Diane worked as a practice manager for a dental group. Greg was in commercial real estate, which meant odd hours, occasional overnight trips, and a schedule that was never quite predictable. They had a son, Elliot, who was 9 now. They had date nights when they remembered, arguments about whose turn it was to call the plumber, a shared streaming password and a shared mortgage, and all the unremarkable intimacy of a life genuinely lived together. Or so Diane believed. She had never had a reason to question Greg. Not seriously. There had been small things over the years: a weekend work trip that felt slightly off, a name she didn't recognize on his phone bill, but she had smoothed those moments over with the easy plaster of trust. She was not a suspicious woman. She was a busy woman. There is a difference. So that Tuesday morning, when she stared at Kayla Mercer's profile photo, her first thought wasn't suspicion, it was confusion. She assumed it was a coincidence, a colleague's daughter maybe, someone from Greg's gym. She almost scrolled past it. Instead, she clicked the profile. And that's when she saw the photo. Greg, unmistakably Greg, standing at a birthday party with his arm around a woman Diane had never seen in her life. The caption read, "Dad and me. 17 today. Love you always." Diane's coffee cup hit the floor, and she didn't notice. She sat completely still for what she would later describe as the longest 3 minutes of her life. Her brain kept performing the same useless loop, trying to find an explanation that wasn't the one staring her in the face. A niece, a goddaughter, an old friend's kid he'd never mentioned. Her mind was extraordinarily reluctant to land on the obvious. But the photo was public, and Kayla's profile was full of them. Greg at Christmas, Greg at a school play, Greg laughing at a backyard barbecue with his arm around a woman named... Diane scrolled to the tagged photos with hands that had begun to shake. A woman named Renee. Renee, who was blonde and slim and looked to be around Diane's age. Renee, who had her own Facebook profile with the last name Mercer. Renee, who in her profile picture was wearing a thin gold band on her left hand. Renee, who was Greg's wife. Diane stood up from the kitchen table so fast her chair scraped back and hit the wall. She walked to the back door. She opened it and stood on the cold concrete step in her socks and just breathed. October air. The smell of someone's fireplace down the street. A dog barking somewhere. The absolute infuriating normality of the world continuing to turn. She went back inside and she did what women in shock sometimes do. She became very, very methodical. She poured the cold coffee down the drain. She opened her laptop. She began to look. What she found over the next 4 hours was meticulous and devastating. Greg and Renee had been together since 2005, 2 years before he met Diane. They had married in 2006, a small ceremony in Renee's hometown in Michigan. Kayla was born in 2007, the same year Diane met Greg at that barbecue. A second child, a boy named Tyler, was born in 2011, the same year Diane and Greg moved into their house in Columbus. 2 families, 2 mortgages. She found a property listing in Renee's name in a suburb of Detroit, co-signed by a Gregory A. Mercer. 2 sets of school plays and birthday cakes and ordinary Tuesdays. One man driving 4 hours up I-75 and stepping between them like he was changing a coat. Diane sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called her sister, Patrice. "I need you to come over," she said. "Don't ask me anything yet. Just come." Patrice arrived in 20 minutes and found Diane at the kitchen table with the laptop open and her face completely dry. No tears. Patrice would later say it was the calmest Diane had ever looked, and it frightened her more than crying would have. Diane showed her everything without saying a word. Patrice read in silence for a long time. Then she looked up and said, "What are you going to do?" Diane had already thought about this during the hours she'd spent waiting for her sister to arrive. She had thought about it very carefully. And she had decided one thing above everything else. She was not going to do any of this wrong. Because Greg was still in commercial real estate, which meant he had assets, a business reputation, and a 401k that Diane had a very legitimate interest in. It meant she had leverage, and it meant that if she called him right now and screamed at him, which every cell in her body wanted to do, she would lose it. She smiled at her sister. It wasn't a warm smile. "I'm going to make an appointment with a lawyer," she said. "Today." What followed over the next 6 weeks was the most disciplined performance of Diane's life. She went to work. She made Elliot's lunches. She kissed Greg goodbye in the mornings with a steadiness that she later told Patrice felt like handling a live wire with bare hands. She said nothing. She showed nothing. She let him believe that the world was exactly as he'd arranged it. Meanwhile, she and her attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Kathleen, who specialized in exactly this kind of case, were building something he would never see coming. They subpoenaed financial records. What came back was staggering. Greg had been siphoning money from their joint accounts and from the proceeds of his real estate deals for years. A second life costs money. School fees for 2 children. A mortgage in Michigan. Holidays. Christmas presents. Over the course of the marriage, the total redirected was just under $340,000. Kathleen set her pen down when she saw the figure and looked at Diane over the top of her glasses. "He's not just a bigamist," she said quietly. "He's a thief." On a Thursday evening in late November, Greg came home to find Diane sitting at the kitchen table with Kathleen beside her and 2 manila folders in front of the empty chair. He stood in the doorway, still holding his car keys, and looked between the 2 women with an expression that moved quickly from confused to careful. "Sit down, Greg," Diane said. He sat. She slid the first folder across the table. It contained on top a printed screenshot of Kayla Mercer's Facebook profile, the birthday photo, the caption, "Dad and me." Greg went very white. He opened his mouth. He closed it. "You don't need to explain," Diane said. "Kathleen is here because you're going to sign some things tonight, and I want a witness." He tried. Of course he tried. The denials, the half-formed explanations, the pivot to anger that Diane had fully anticipated and fully prepared for. But Kathleen was patient and precise, and the second folder contained the financial documentation that made argument not just pointless but dangerous for him. Diane didn't raise her voice once. The divorce was filed the following week. Because Greg had been legally married to Renee since 2006, his marriage to Diane was, in the eyes of the law, void, which meant Kathleen was able to pursue a different and considerably more aggressive financial remedy than a standard divorce. Greg's real estate business, the retirement accounts, the equity in the Columbus house, Diane received a settlement that Kathleen described professionally as thorough. Greg's real estate license was flagged during the financial investigation. He lost it 6 months later. Renee, for her part, had been contacted by Diane's attorney early in the process. Not out of cruelty, but because she was also a victim who deserved to know. The two women never became friends, but they spoke twice, carefully and briefly, and Diane would say later that those were two of the hardest and most important conversations of her life. Diane moved into a smaller house in a neighborhood she actually loved more, closer to Elliot's school, with a porch where she drank her coffee in the mornings and read actual books. She got a cat named Tuesday because that was the day everything changed, and because she had earned the right to that kind of small, pointed joke. Elliot was resilient in the way children are when their remaining parent refuses to fall apart. She made sure of that too. Some betrayals don't announce themselves. They live quietly inside ordinary days for years, feeding on the trust of someone too good and too busy to imagine them. Diane hadn't been naive. She had simply been decent, and for a long time she'd paid for it. But decency, it turns out, is also a form of patience. And patience, when it finally moves, moves with extraordinary precision. If this story made you feel something, you know what to do. Like, subscribe and drop a comment below. What would you have done in Diane's place? We'd love to hear from you.